just we are checking if everything is working. Catherine, maybe if you hear us, just that we know that we can hear ourselves.
Hi, I hear you.
Okay, great. So we are, in a few minutes we will start. This was just a testing to see if it's working now. Thank you. Okay, we are starting with the second panel today called Decolonization of the Peripheries. So I welcome everybody here in the room, also our panelists online and also audience who is online. So the first one will be Dr. Catherine Baker, reader in 20th century history at the University of Hull. Then we are proceeding with Anton LEDERER and Margarethe MAKOVEC, founding members and artistic directors of Rotor, Center for Contemporary Art from Graz. And in the end, Iva Kovac and Elvis Krstulovic, members of artistic duo called Focus Grupa. So the plan is to do it like this. Catherine will be the first And then if we have somebody who wants to refer directly to her talk, we can have one question. And this will be the same with rotor and with focus group. And in the end, we will have the questions like all together who want to ask. So, Catherine, welcome. I hope you can hear us and that we can begin.
Thank you. I hear you very well. I'm just going to see if I can share a presentation with you. Great. So do you see this now? Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this today. And I'm Catherine Baker. I'm a historian and cultural studies scholar who started out actually as a researcher investigating struggles over narratives of national and cultural identity in Croatia through popular music, which of course turn very much on symbolic oppositions between Europe and the Balkans. And this was a phenomenon that, many scholars have tried to explain through adaptations of post-colonial theory. At the same time as I was doing that work, I was trying to make sense of how the nation where I live and work deals with its difficult past. And I started through that wanting to answer, how do the politics of representation, exoticism, and difference that we see around constructions of Europe and the Balkans relate to the politics of representation, exoticism, and difference, which in British and Anglo-American cultural studies revolve around the question of race, as articulated by scholars like Stuart Hall. And there's a quotation of Stewart Hall's, which I have adapted for the title of this talk. So it's from this perspective then that I want to talk about sugar, a commodity which became part of everyday European food culture through enslaved labor and colonial extraction. Now, today in the UK at the moment, scholars, heritage professionals and the public are going through an extensive process of re-examining the national past and the traces which colonialism and the Atlantic slave trade have left in our institutions, our built environment, and our racialized social inequalities. This is happening in the face of a growing political and media backlash against treating that heritage critically. In the heritage sector, where organizations like the National Trust are responsible for looking after historic sites and interpreting their past for the public, when it comes to things like historic houses and stately homes, so many of these were built or bought in the 18th or early 19th century by men who had made their money through commodity trading in the British Empire and now wanted to convert their wealth into the traditional form of capital and status in Britain, which is land and property. The National Trust commissioned a study called Addressing Our Histories of Colonialism and Historic Slavery, which published its interim report in September 2020 and was immediately attacked then in the right-wing press. It covered 93 National Trust properties where the researchers had found such links, including the one I've chosen to put on the slide here, Nunnington Hall in North Yorkshire. This was bought in 1839 by the Rutson family, who had made their money in sugar, cotton, and before that, the Atlantic slave trade. And I've chosen this one because it's, I think, the geographically closest National Trust site to me, which had links with the colonial trade in sugar. So, in the UK heritage sector now, there's a move to explain to visitors that, if, for instance, a landowner had owned a sugar plantation in the Caribbean or had made his money in trading sugar, that sugar was produced on colonized land in, say, Jamaica or Barbados. It was produced by enslaved Africans who had been kidnapped from West Africa and brutally transported across the Atlantic, and then by their descendants who had been born into this system of chattel slavery, which lasted in the British Empire until 1833. And when that system was abolished, by the way, it was the slaveholders who were compensated by the British government, not the enslaved. I'm just going to pause for a moment and check into the chat window because I can see something flashing up, and I just want to make sure that I'm not getting any messages. Okay, could I please ask if anything goes wrong with the sound or the feed, if somebody else could please put their microphone on and please alert me, just so that I don't waste your time trying to check messages. So I'll go on and I will talk about the system of Atlantic slavery, which I've just mentioned. And, you know, this is also what we could say brought the system of race as we know it today into being. That is the idea that all human beings and all places in the world can be classified according to where they belong in a racialized hierarchy, where European descent and whiteness represent the pinnacle of reason and civilization, whereas blackness and African descent denote backwardness, savagery, and ultimately less humanity. The Europeans who participated in the Atlantic slave trade and in the European colonial enterprise more widely had to internalize this division of the world in order to normalize the idea that they deserved to have Africans and indigenous people subservient to them. That idea then persisted in the settler colonial states of North and South America, later too in South Africa and Australasia, as they became independent of European rule. So all of this is what we mean when we say that race and racism in the present day are a historical legacy of colonialism. And one of the scholars whose work most illuminates that in the context of Britain and the Caribbean is Stuart Hall. So Hall is one of the most significant British sociologists of the late 20th and early 21st century, for those who don't know his work. He co-founded what was called the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies. He used Gramsci's work to rethink how Marxism could conceive of the relationship between ideology and culture. He diagnosed the divisive social and economic politics of Thatcherism, which in many ways in Britain we're still living with. And he wanted to understand ethnicity, diaspora, and race through a lens which was simultaneously anti-essentialist, but also uncompromising when it came to naming the continued effects of empire and colonial domination. Hall was born in Kingston, Jamaica in 1932. He came to study English literature at Oxford in 1951. He joined the British Far Left. He was one of many intellectuals who left the British Communist Party after the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956. And his own diasporic experience was the foundation for his sociological thinking about identity, ethnicity, and race. He really developed this at the turn of the 1980s and 1990s in response to the identity-making projects of the new Black British generation, who were the children of his generation and who had been born in the UK. And in response also to the fixation with identity that was gripping Western intellectuals at the end of the Cold War. Part of what fueled that, of course, was what they saw through media of the Yugoslav wars. One of Hall's most significant essays was Old and New Identities, Old and New Ethnicities in 1991. And in this, he wrote what's become one of his most famous quotations, which you can hopefully see on the screen. He was reacting against an idea which the racist right wing in Britain had been articulating ever since the large-scale phase of migration to Britain from the Caribbean, which had begun in 1948, which was the idea that Black people didn't belong in Britain and had no history there. So against this, he said, people like me who came to England in the 1950s have been there for centuries. I was coming home. I am the sugar at the bottom of the English cup of tea. Here he means the reason he was born in Jamaica was that his ancestors were taken from West Africa to be sold to slaveholders in the Caribbean, who put them to work, most likely on Jamaica's sugar plantations. He goes on, there are thousands of others beside me that are the cup of tea itself. And in the same way, he's talking about Britain's imperial domination of India, where the tea was grown, as the context behind Britain having such a large South Asian diaspora. And so he goes on further. Where does it come from? Ceylon, Sri Lanka, India, he's talking about the tea. That is the outside history, but is inside the history of the English. There is no English history without that other history. And so Hall dwells for longer on the image-driven history of tea, perhaps, in this passage, but of course it's got equally much to say to us about sugar. This is a call to continually keep making visible how far English and British national identity had been constituted by participating in empire, and how far the oppression and extraction of empire had made possible the everyday consumer culture that the middle class by the 18th century took for granted. That culture involved not only sugar, but also all of the food and drink which could be sweetened by it, including that English cup of tea, the cappuccino on the Croatian coffee table, and all the marvelous cakes that Habsburg coffee culture has bequeathed to Central Europe. All of these owe their everyday ubiquity to the fact of coloniality and the slave trade, which made it possible to make sugar such a mass commodity. In the 15th and 16th century, sugar was a rare, expensive luxury that rulers would use to create exquisite displays at royal feasts. The very first European efforts at plantation slavery, before even the colonization of the Caribbean, were plantations in the Azores, where Portuguese traders brought enslaved labor to produce sugar. These Portuguese traders were the first Europeans to enslave captives in West Africa. By the late 17th century, sugar production had been increased so much through the colonization of the Caribbean and the Atlantic slave trade that it was a mass commodity. It was affordable by then to all but the poor. In the 18th century, it was probably the most valuable commodity in the world. And all of this depended, we're reminded by historians like Lisa Lowe, on the enslavement of Africans and the colonization of the Caribbean, as well indeed as the use of East Asian indentured laborers who were brought into the Caribbean to replace the Africans who were freed from slavery in 1833. Now, what, however, does this have to do with Rijeka, or the coast around it? In the title of this talk, I used the phrase the post-Yugoslav coast, but we could also talk about the post-Habsburg coast, or further down the Adriatic, the post-Venetian coast. Both of those legacies will be important as I go on, and there were questions about this Croatian coast, which could also resonate in Slovenia or Montenegro, hence me talking about the post-Yugoslav coast in the title. This part of the Adriatic coast was at what we could call a double distance from the legacies of coloniality that Hall was talking about, and that the National Trust is talking about in a British context. Firstly, of course, this region wasn't part of a state which had colonized overseas territory itself. And secondly, it and the people living there were under the imperial rule of another power, the Habsburg Empire. Croats and Slovenes would have to secede from Habsburg rule before they could exercise their self-determination, which they did at the end of the First World War, joining the kingdom which became Yugoslavia. So, this is different to asking what do coloniality or slavery mean to British national identity, or Dutch, or Swedish. And also, of course, what happened to the material wealth which did come into Rijeka through trade with the European colonial economy is a much more complex question than in Britain, where that wealth has stayed within the same ruling class. And yet, these points of distance do not exhaust the ways in which this coast was entangled with the European project and with what the enslavement of Africans and subservience of Asians meant to Europeans during Habsburg times. It is cultural history and cultural representation which perhaps best illustrates that those entanglements were there. And, focus group have, of course, articulated this with their interpretation of the Vedute Ideate. This kind of approach, thinking about cultural history and cultural representation, is one which scholars of German-speaking Europe have taken for some time now, in showing that the racialized hierarchies of European coloniality were already salient in the German-speaking cultural area before Imperial Germany was even unified or began to launch its own colonial project. The Habsburg Empire, of course, didn't even bring such a project to fruition, though there were schemes such as ideas to colonize the Nicobar Islands or Solomon Islands. There were the Oriental companies founded in the 18th century, in which Charles Foley, who also had that stake in Rijeka's sugar trade, had an interest. And of course, there were the many people from the Habsburg lands who joined other European powers' colonial projects as missionaries, commercial agents, doctors, and explorers. Some of those travellers indeed obtained and sent back African artefacts, which became part of the collections of Slovenian and Croatian museums. The histories of figures like Dragutin Lehrman, a Croat from Karlovac, who joined the Stanley expedition to Congo for King Leopold II of Belgium, and then became a provincial official for some years in this brutal Belgian colonial regime, show that South Slavs could aspire to become subjects who were putting European coloniality into practice, even though there wasn't a colonial project associated with their nation. Now, by the time we get on to Lehrman and King Leopold of Belgium, we're talking about the late 19th century. By that point, German companies whose advertising played on commodity racism were also marketing their wares in the Habsburg lands. The exploitative human expeditions, which put Africans and indigenous people in front of European spectators as fictitious spectacles of primitivism, were sometimes docking in Trieste on their way up to Central Europe. But even before that, even before the late 19th century, we can talk about entanglements with coloniality through culture. The transnational culture of consumption and status, which was starting to define what it meant to be modern and what it meant to be European. European art in the 18th century, for instance, shows that having an enslaved African boy as a page in your household was a status symbol. And, even if these youths weren't formally enslaved in a legal sense in the country where that household was, structurally, the fact that they were in servitude was a consequence of the system of Atlantic slavery. Now, how many rich households with black servants might have passed through Rijeka on their travels in the 18th century? Did any of these young black men ever take advantage of the chaos of a working port in order to seek freedom, as they did, for instance, in the much bigger ports of London or Bristol? Now, these histories might have no answer now, but they're still within the space of possibility which emerges when we think about empire and enslavement so transnationally. Indeed, if we were to think of the wider post-Yugoslav coast, that coast which is post-Venetian, and indeed south of Kotor post-Ottoman, we'd also have to think about the Eastern Mediterranean slave trade, which captains from Ulcin in Montenegro engaged in. This was based on the enslavement of people from East Africa, who were then brought to markets in North Africa to be sold around the Ottoman Empire. And when captains from Ulcin started bringing back some of these enslaved people on their ships to work in their own households or to be sold on, this led to a small and concentrated black diaspora in Ulcin, which at its height contained dozens of households. Some of their descendants, indeed, are still alive today in Montenegro. When we think of coloniality in Rijeka and in this part of the Croatian and post-Yugoslav coast, though, the immediate context is that of Habsburg colonialism. Indeed, for the dual monarchy period, maybe we'd even need to ask how far there were specifically Hungarian colonial aspirations, which manifested in Hungarian policies towards the port of Rijeka. I'm inspired to think that way by the historian Zoltan Ginelli and his research agenda on a semi-peripheral kind of Hungarian colonialism. Rijeka and its sugar refinery, indeed, even seems to play a peripheral part in the history of Belgian colonialism. Foley and Arnold, who started the refinery, were based in Antwerp during that 80-year period where what is now Belgium had come back under the same Habsburg crown as Rijeka. The directors of the company continued to come from Antwerp as well. So, how then did the interests in colonial trade, which these Flemish merchants were pursuing through the trading company model in the 18th century, relate to commercial interests in empire after 1830, when Belgium became independent of the Netherlands, or to the colonial project which King Leopold II launched in the late 19th century? Now, I don't know the answer to this at all, But Rijeka leaves a small trace in the Flemish and then Belgian colonial past, even as a route not taken, perhaps. So let's bring ourselves back to the ideas about making visible the legacies of coloniality that Hall voiced in 1991, using that image of the sugar and the cup of tea, which points also to the materialities and the commodities of European colonialism. When Hall says the notion that identity could be told as two histories, one over here, one over there, never having spoken to one another, is simply not tenable any longer in an increasingly globalized world. It resonates perhaps with the work of Charlotte Chari and Catharine Verdery, authors of one of the central ideas that I wanted to explore further in my book, Race and the Yugoslav Region, who point out that neither post-colonialism or post-socialism are conditions which were confined only to one part of the globe. The collapse of state socialist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe and the USSR had consequences all over the world, not just in that space they had directly governed. The consequences of most of the territories in the global south, which had been under European colonial rule, gaining their independence after 1945, similarly were not limited to those former colonies and their former metropoles. There is no such thing as separate post-colonial and post-socialist worlds. And so the legacies of European colonialism, including race, can and should also be traced through what has often been thought of as the post-socialist space, where Rijeka, as well as many other places, are located. Back once again then to Hall, who himself, of course, was in a post-colonial moment and was theorizing identity in the early years of post-socialism. At the end of the essay that I've been quoting today, he insists that every political struggle and every social identity is constituted through the local, that is, through the particularity with which global processes and transformations and struggles have manifested in any given place. So, we could follow Hall then and ask, what were the local modalities through which colonialism was experienced and lived in Rijeka, and along this post-Habsburg and post-Venetian, later post-Yugoslav stretch of the Adriatic coast. At the same time, in asking about how Rijeka was entangled with coloniality and enslavement through the sugar which came in through its refinery and through other colonial commodities, you help to answer, even for us in Britain perhaps, where did the sugar go after enslaved labourers had extracted it from those plantations in its raw form, after it had been shipped back across the Atlantic and sold? The story doesn't end with the historic British country houses, or even with the English cup of tea. It continues as the sugar was exported on again to places like Rijeka and many others where it was refined, to meet the demands of consumers in this much longer backwash of commodity culture and commodity racism, which flowed across Europe. Because it was through consumption, as well as through culture, which Europe's middle class would come to define part of what it meant to be modern and to be European. And so it's from that perspective too that we can think about the global roots of sugar and of coloniality, and indeed of race. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. So, do we have any question now directly connected to the talk? No? You have a question. Okay. Eva?
Hello, Catherine, and thank you for your very interesting presentation. I was wondering, in relation to your research, your presentation now, and also your book on race in the Yugoslav region, maybe if you can expand on the question of construction of whiteness within the Yugoslav context and the Balkan context.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is it's a very complex and ambiguous question, but, essentially the way that we can look at the construction of whiteness in former Yugoslavia and in the Balkan region is two processes at the same time. On the one hand, if aspiring to be fully recognized as a European means aspiring to, be recognized, not just as modern, but also as fully white, then there's a racialized dimension, towards these aspirations and towards the idea of what Europe means, even perhaps, somewhere like Croatia, somewhere like the rest of Southeast Europe, which was not directly as a political entity involved in colonial projects the way that Britain or the Netherlands, for instance, were. And at the same time as this, and interrelated with this, is the fact that Western Europe has also since at least the 18th century constructed itself against the East of Europe, and this is the reason why so many scholars like Maria Dadorova, like Besna Goldsworthy, for instance, those whose work I was reading when I was first beginning my own work, they made sense of these stereotypes of Europe and against the Balkans by adapting the post-colonial theory of Edward Said, for instance, and his work on Orientalism. And what has happened, as is well known in so many different contexts, is that from Western European perspectives, the East of Europe and the Balkans are not understood as being fully European. They're having to prove themselves all the time. And in the Balkan context, of course, what tinges that even further is the fact that so much of the Balkans were under Ottoman rule for centuries. They were ruled by an empire which had its centre outside Europe. And, we could talk further if we wanted to about the ways in which, Easternness and Turkishness and, Islam, of course, have been racialized. So, all of this has left, whatever whiteness might be, ascribed to Central and Southeast Europe, and particularly perhaps to the Balkans, in an incredibly contingent, ambiguous position. It is conditional, perhaps. It is, still a whiteness which is not so much at the centre of the European imagination as that northern Western whiteness. And the tensions then which this causes, I think, are at the heart of many articulations of not just explicit whiteness, but also in an implicit sense, perhaps Europeanness as well.
Okay. Maybe we can leave other questions for later. Thank you, Catherine. So we can proceed now with Anton Lederer from Rotor. He will represent their work.
So, thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to come here to Rijeka and take part in this conference. Today would have been one of the rare occasions that MARGARETHE, MAKOVEC and I speak together on a panel, because normally it's only one of us going to some of these events and the other one is taking care of the art center and of our children and so on. This time we are together here, but the last weeks have been very unexpectedly busy for us, as we started to build up with 2 other organizations in Austria what we call now Office Ukraine, and this is a shelter project for Ukrainian artists on the run. So we are since 4 weeks, day and night, working for this. And this is also the reason that Margarethe said, please let me sit there, then I don't have to prepare myself. So now I'm here talking to you. And also I did not prepare that much, a very critical lecture, but while I was listening now to the other very well prepared contributions, I changed my plans a little bit and will focus on an artistic production that we could realize in Graz in the framework of our sugar project, and I would like to bring you in touch with this. You can see screened now the poster from an exhibition that happened last year in our art center in Graz, in Rotor, titled Sugar, Industrial Heritage and Colonialism. Our engagement, our interest in the sugar, in the industrial production of sugar, firstly, started in the year 2018 when we could visit the big exhibition that the artist Ilona Nemeth, she was mentioned already tonight by Ferenc Grof, when she had her big exhibition Eastern Sugar in the Kunsthalle Bratislava. Ilona Nemeth, an old friend of our art center, invited us to go there and visit this exhibition, and it left very big impression, the way how she collected over the years information about the decline of the sugar industry in Slovakia, in her home country, and invited other artists to contribute in this project, and even showed some kind of first draft of a Slovakian sugar museum. So I think maybe tomorrow Ilona will speak herself about her project, but this was the beginning of our interest in this sugar topic. Dealing with this topic for years, from 2018 on, when Ilona then invited us to contribute and step in the project, we could finally, as a first peak of these investigations, carry out the before mentioned exhibition in 2020. And you see here in the entrance room of this exhibition a very similar picture to what you can see here in the exhibition space of Trugomore. The work from, well-known work from the Focus Grouper. Yeah, it's quite similar to that, what you see over there. This work was in our exhibition of very specific importance, because it allowed us to create a chronological narration, to start or to go chronological with the produced works through the exhibition, as the piece of the focus group marks the beginning of sugar production on the territory of the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy. So this is really a very lucky situation for people like us who were interested in how this sugar industrialization later developed in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So in the entrance room we could really start with the very beginning, mid of 18th century, when the sugar production started in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. This was the presentation in the same exhibition of the work by Ilona Nemeth, the Eastern Sugar Archive. We saw another version already before in the first session when Ferenc Grof showed us the picture how it was presented in the La Box gallery in Bourges. And also this one is already familiar to you, so it is the version of the maps from plants to plantations, from plantation to plants, the version that Ferenc created for our exhibition. I just want to add that he was very open to and interested to include information coming from our context, from the Graz context, from this particular exhibition, to incorporate this information in these two maps. So this was a very challenging work to collect from the new contributions in this exhibition information and to bring it, to forward it to the artist, and he found gaps in between, some places where he could add this information and kind of make another version of it. And all in all, the exhibition and this project opened to us the possibility to invite several artists to and commission new works. One of these pieces you can see here in the foreground of this picture was done by the artist from northern Bohemia, city Ústí nad Labem, Stena Kolečkova, Sweet Shadow of Past Times. So Stena Kolečkova is actually a photographic artist mainly, but in this case she turned out to be a very good sculptor also, and created this modular system of objects made of white sugar and brown sugar. And this competition between these two types of sugar, the sugar coming from the beet, from the sugar beet, and the sugar produced out of the sugar cane, this is something very investigated about a sugar factory, sugar refinery that existed in our city, in Graz, in the 19th century. So the piece traces, and she included the German term for traces, Spuren, also in the title. Traces, Spuren, was a piece realized in 2021, a new commissioned piece for this exhibition. And here on this photograph, you can see that Elisabeth Gschiel mounted lots of various information she found about this historic Graz sugar refinery in a kind of architectural map. The artist herself, she is educated as an architect, first of all. Later then she started an artistic career also. And here she put these different pictures, plans, texts together by using a sewing machine. So this is a photograph from her studio, taken while she was producing that piece. The blue color of the image is because she used the technique of cyanotype, I think it's in English, cyanotype. And this is a classical technology that was used for decades for creating architectural plans. Now in the past, let's say 20 years maybe, also in art it had a kind of a renaissance, and it's used now a lot. And Elisabeth Gschiel used also this technology. I don't know, is it? No? Yes. Did you see the sewing picture before? No, not? This one. It was somehow frozen, no? Yeah. Okay, I was speaking about something you couldn't see. So this is that photograph from her studio. When you see how she was sewing the pieces together. Okay, so the next image shows a detail of that big architectural plan when she was using this various material. And here you can see a contemporary drawing from the first half of the 19th century, showing that sugar refinery in a place that is today part of the city of Graz, but back then, of course, it was outside the city. It was surrounded, you see, by a forest and fields. And a cut through that building. And what you can see, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 or 8 story building. The core of the building, but a relatively small part, is the actual refinery where the raw material, and soon I will speak about that, where the raw material is brought in and refined by using of heat, first of all. And the big rest, the other parts of the building, all these stories, are simply used to dry the sugar loaves. The sugar loaves, yes, the sugar loaves. You know what sugar loaves are. There in the exhibition you can see the mold of this sugar loaf, and also here these molds were used, and all these floors are here to dry the sugar loaves. This building, many of you will know it, yes, it's the Cukrarna art. Now it's used as an art space, a new museum, Kunsthalle in Ljubljana. And this particular building is approximately built in the same time than the one I have showed before in Graz. Yeah? And here, going back now to this one, please keep that lots of stories in mind. And here on that building, you see exactly the same order, yeah? The windows, and all these stories here in that former Cukrarna had the same use. Yeah? The height of the stories was very low, even so low that you cannot go without going down. And in Ljubljana they are in the lucky situation that the building still exists and that it was very, very nicely reconstructed and is now this beautiful museum.
It's interesting to mention here that Graz sugar factory was owned by the same
Yes, MARGARETHE.
Then the Styria factory.
probably also the moment why Anton showed that, how to say, still existing building, because in Graz the sugar refinery is not more, how to say, there are just some buildings left, but not the refinery. So it was, how to say, once burned and I think never really reconstructed. But it is interesting that the same, how to say, investors at that time, a bank house from Vienna, Gschiel and Arnstein, was owning for a certain period these two factories in Ljubljana and in Graz. That's probably nice to add.
Yeah, that was mentioned today already, and that's quite interesting to keep in mind also this connection between the sugar business and the bank business. Yeah? In many cases, we can find this interrelation between these two businesses, and also here, it's good that Margarethe mentioned it, also here the Museum Zuccarna in Ljubljana is not only architecturally connected to Graz, also the owner, the owning structure for a certain period, only for some years, but in these few years, the same bank house was standing behind the two factories. But now I would like to come back to this competition, to this ongoing competition between these two plants. This is here a part of the work that Elisabeth Gschiel did. She was also sewing with her sewing machine these two images. Here you can see the sugar cane plant, and on the other picture the sugar beet. And it was mentioned today already that in the time of the continental blockade, this in the times of the Napoleonic Wars, due to this continental blockade, when the transport of sugar cane from the colonies was somehow blocked, this gave a very strong impulse for the continental investigation and research and start of the production of the sugar beet. Yeah? So this is in the years around 1806, 1809, I think, when this continental blockade was in power. And in several places in Europe in the same time, people started to remember, okay, there is this beet also, and wasn't that beet sweet as well, so we can, without having the raw material now from the colonies, we could start to deal with this beet here. So the continental blockade was already over when this factory here in Ljubljana and the factory in Graz started to produce. And now it was for us kind of surprising that those new built factories in the 1820s in Graz, I think it was 1827, let me see, 1824, and Ljubljana a little bit later, that these factories started to produce with sugar cane, when the sugar beet production on the continent started already. And first I didn't understand why, yeah? And then fortunately we came in contact with Dale Tomic, that you listened to today already, and we were asking him, Dale, do you have an explanation for that? How comes that the sugar beet production is already 10, 15 years going on, and then somebody opens in the middle of the land, yeah, not next to the coast, but some 300 kilometers from here, opens a sugar factory and starts it with sugar cane. How is this possible? Huh? Because you have to imagine, we are in the year 1824, 300 kilometers away from Rijeka. How do you bring a large amount of sugar cane to Rijeka to Graz in that time? Yeah? We are not sure that the sugar from the colonies that was processed in Graz really came via Rijeka, but there are not so many options. The other option would be Trieste. But let's say it came to Rijeka, that sugar back then. Yeah? So there wasn't a railway in this time. So Dale said 1937 was the railway established in Cuba, but here in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, that railway connecting Graz with Trieste was opened later. Yeah? In 1824 we had no railway. So that means the barrels, or in some years boxes, like Dale also described it, where the raw material from the factories is coming to Europe, had to be transported with carriages, these 300 kilometers. And now think about the size of this factory and imagine how many boxes, how many barrels have been necessary to produce or process this factory. So a big effort, yeah? But Dale had a very simple explanation why the factory started with the cane sugar. And he said, listen, it's like to compare it with the car industry from today. You have on one hand the fuel-driven cars, and you have the electro cars, and it needs a certain time till the new technology takes completely over. Yeah? And he said that might have absolutely the same before. Yeah? In the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy, the people were used to this technology that was introduced first in Rijeka to process the cane sugar. And the new thing, the beet sugar that was mainly introduced in the northern Germany or in France, was that the people didn't know where to get the material from, how to process it, and how, and for the other thing, the experts were already here in the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy, first introduced here in Rijeka. So this is why, even in a time when the sugar beet was already introduced, they went a step back and took the material from the colonies that came very, very a long way to Rijeka, and then another long way, let's say a week at least, it needed to bring the carriages, lots of carriages from Rijeka to Graz. And now, I mean, this project by Elisabeth Gschiel, for me personally, opened more questions than it answered. Yeah? And one of these questions, and I cannot give you an answer, I will just ask it now, is, in the beginning of the 19th century, the sugar was definitely, and it was mentioned already today, a very, very precious commodity still. Yeah? Imagine the sugar coming from far away to a harbor here in the Adriatic, then again a long way to Graz, then to process this. So it must have been a precious commodity. Not everybody could afford that. But the people using in the Austrian core land using that sugar, have they been aware back then that this is a product coming from so far away? And the main question is, did they know that it is in connection with slave labor? So this is what concerns me, and I don't have an answer actually, but I hope that one day somebody from the Austrian context will write or research exactly about that question. Yeah? So I don't know if there are maybe some texts from the time, from the beginning of that 19th or first half of 19th century, when this sugar coming from still from the colonies influenced the Austrian kitchen so much, brought up a big amount of sweets that didn't exist before. Yeah, so this there was we saw before on the coffee table in England some of these cakes. Yeah, all this was in a large scale then possible when these sugar factories started to produce. But was there a consciousness about the origin of this product, yeah, or was it not? Yeah? So this is a question that would be interesting to answer one day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anton. So, there are any questions? One question? Okay.
There's no other question. I just, it's more a comment, but I really wanted to somehow reflect on something new that you brought for me within kind of, you know, that your talk brings in, is this idea of knowledge. Because, for example, with CATHARINE, she spoke about how culture or cultural objects were vehicles of coloniality. And I really like how your talk expands this also to production of knowledge. And specifically, I guess you brought two kinds of knowledges. One is a very kind of specialist technical knowledge that you speculate kind of within the context of Austria-Hungary originates in Rijeka and then, you know, reproduces coloniality in other locations, more kind of maybe not obviously so, but reproducing them more towards the center of the empire, which is kind of interesting, coming from Antwerp to Rijeka and then back to center or closer to center of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So that's, I think, very interesting. Also in reading the role of Rijeka, you know, and its role of coloniality within the Austrian Empire. Yeah, so that's one, and then the other one is also the one that you're asking, like whether that happened with knowledge of kind of slave labor that originates. I really, like, it's more a comment, but I really kind of thought that that's something new was brought for the talk. Thanks.
Okay, so Elvis, as you started, maybe you can join us here, and Eva. So
maybe one fast. Only it's another comment on the comment. Today, when we visited the city museum and the second floor with the history of the sugar local sugar factory here, you cannot find an answer on this question, but what you can see there is exactly from that time, from the beginning of the 19th century, a beautiful collection of sugar boxes, or how is it called, you know, where they put formally the sugar in. This sugar box, is it called sugar box? I don't know. You know, the small box where you have the sugar in. And there you can see that more than half of these boxes in the vitrine have a small lock. And this is the proof how precious that thing was back then. Yeah? So sugar was in the beginning of 19th century a commodity that in the household it was locked. You know, so it was not open accessibly. So I think this question of precious commodity and knowledge about the origin is somehow linked, I have the feeling. This is, yeah.
Okay, we will have time after Eva and Elvis for more thoughts, questions, comments. Thank you, Anton. Please join us, Eva and Elvis.
Let me just check something. Don't share the screen yet.
Screen.
What? Yeah. So to just kind of give you the project was mentioned quite some times today, but just to give us kind of this project started on the invitation by WHW for the Labin Art Biennale, Labin Industrial Art Biennale in 2018. And kind of their initiative was to look into the history of the refinery. And at the time, the refinery was under restoration as part of the European Capital of Culture. So all the images that we now are able to see were under boards, so we were not able to visit it at that point. And so what we did is we kind of went through literature and written commentary and kind of different things that were written about the refinery itself, kind of in a search for a clue and in search for something that we could work with. In the meantime, since the initial presentation in the Museum of Contemporary Art within the Labin Art Biennale project, we managed to write an article with access to the paintings themselves, so that we had kind of an opportunity to look at them more closely. And then within the Eastern Sugar project, we were able to kind of refine, I guess, our framing or understanding of these images within the context of the various histories of sugar. Our project is a case study. It's a case study of the privileged company of Trieste and Rijeka. The company opened or was founded in 1750 by the invitation of the Habsburg crown. So it's their initiative, for which they invited the Perolli family from Antwerp, the family that had experience with sugar trade and sugar business itself. So Austria-Hungary at this point tries to enter the market of sugar without prior experience, so they invite Antwerp bourgeois to lead the business. The purpose of the company was initially, or the idea of the Habsburgs was to be more export-oriented, which would turn out not to be really how the history of the company developed. Anyways, 2 years after the company was founded, because it's a Trieste and Rijeka company, so first in Trieste and then in Rijeka, the refinery itself is founded 2 years later in 1752. So a couple of years prior, Rijeka, the city was, or the town, was made a free port in the meaning of tax-free port. And the company itself receives, monopoly on sugar import. So this is the kind of economical framework for the company to operate, and also a usual framework for the times, kind of monopoly capitalism. And so one thing that is important to restate again and again, I think, company did not have any direct connection, regardless of state level or not, to Caribbean kind of cane, so they didn't own it. They imported it through different ports, so it didn't even go directly to Rijeka, but it went to Marseille, for example, from Caribbean, and then it came to Rijeka. But this is also a very usual thing for kind of similar refineries across Europe, because at that time raw sugar is, let's say, pre-processed in the colonies, comes in raw state in Europe, and then is kind of shipped to various refineries where it's refined and made a final product. So this is a very typical thing in the development of this industry for the time. Rijeka refinery produced sugar itself, so refined sugar, various sweets, and alcoholic beverages. Some of these can be seen in what is now the museum of the city of Rijeka. Rum, for instance, is shown. And so within the company, something that we found through literature first and then later explored more in the room itself, is a room that's located on the second floor of the museum, now museum, then refinery. And also it's now kind of, one might consider kind of a focal point of the building, which was a room for the then director of the company, Peter von Vierendels, who also kind of, and I kind of always think this is interesting, who also oversaw the process of making the room or making the decorations on the room. So in a sense, kind of reconfirming that these paintings, wall paintings, also have to do with his own tastes and his own wants. So it's a room that has 16 wall paintings overall, out of these there is 4 large ones and 12 small ones. These are vedutas. Salon is called Veduta Salon because these paintings are vedutas, so cityscapes. And these are not real cityscapes, these are imagined cityscapes. In local literature, we call them idealized landscapes. And these are, I guess, collages or compilations of parts of architecture, European architecture, mostly classicist, Baroque elements, with some details of chinoiserie, or kind of fashion for exotica of the time. So we can find, for example, in the painting that in the central painting for our work, there's like a roof that has some semblance of Far Eastern, let's say Chinese roof. And these are round paintings, so they're populated. They have kind of citizens of various classes present, and they're engaged in different activities. So this is a central painting. It's located on the north wall of the salon. It's the left painting. Currently, like if you come now, it's partly covered by the stove. Painting is a harbor image of a harbor with Austrian flagship there, with various figures, a bourgeois couple taking a stroll, some merchants and sailors having a discussion, and then a series of uniform figures that for the most part are considered to be slaves. They are bare feet, bound hands, bent back, kind of depersonalized, and they're watched over by the gendarmerie, maybe another argument for saying that these are slaves. What is for us interesting when we talk about these figures is first, they're not African slaves, which if we go back to the company's core business, or the refinery's core business to be more exact, is not necessarily logical. As far as we know, the company didn't trade or get anything from China, and these are in the literature they're referred to as Chinese, I guess kind of based on their haircut. And so why Chinese was kind of one of the confusing points in our understanding of the images. And so when we were talking about it and thinking about, what do these represent, with some new information from Catherine, we can maybe revisit this. But our understanding was that these images represent aspiration of the company. So this is kind of, or the director, kind of aspiration for the company that had, I guess, with the intention to do mostly export, have global reach. And so this is one. And then perhaps if we look at it more locally, more interesting question for us is how can we based on these figures, enter the discussion of history of city of Rijeka, more particularly history of its industrialization and modernization, its development, due to the fact that this company marks the beginning of the modernization process and industrialization process. So, as such, being crucial basically for the development of Rijeka, at least the way it developed. And so, starting from these images, how can we unpack this history in a different way and link it to global flows of capital having to do with colonialism?
Sorry. So in the existing research on the palace and Rijeka's sugar industry, some texts mention the existence of the slaves in Vedute Date, but more as a curiosity. There has been no critical account on the link between slavery and Rijeka's industrial development. As much as the forced labor, which was the core of the sugar business, and the base of Rijeka's 18th century development was primarily exploiting black African labor in the Caribbean, what we find symptomatic of the non-existent discourse about race in the ex-Yugoslav region is the fact that the East Asian slaves' presence seems unworthy of analysis in the local accounts. as Catherine Baker, who spoke earlier, has emphasized in her Race and the Yugoslav region, as well as in the talk she just gave, these territories are not outside of the discourse on race. Now going back to the sugar refinery, or the talk of the sugar refinery, if you can just move this. So this is the object. It didn't switch for some. It didn't.
We just have to wait, I think.
Nešto drugo je na slici.
No, go up, and then she's out of full screen.
It's okay.
Edge.
Okay, super. So these objects are part of the display of the work in the exhibition Sugar of the East, and for us, these objects show a certain, or for us, these objects and these images, these graphs, disclosed a certain discrepancy between the types of work done and distinction between what is considered free labor and unfree labor or slavery. So in most of the accounts on the history of the refinery, a clear analogy is drawn between the types of work performed and the worker's ethnicity. In general, while omitting slave labor, these accounts do show that the closer the workers were to home, the lower was their position in the company. Some of the accounts make a poignant critique of class relations, whereby the local Southeastern Europeans were treated as the lower class, while many of the contemporary accounts, on the other hand, show a petty bourgeois admiration for the industrialists, while praising the rapid development of the city brought by the industry. At the same time, these accounts do also express resentment about class relations or class divisions that cross across ethnic lines. But neither the Marxist nor the petty bourgeois critique accounts for the absence of the representation of the slave labor, which is the invisible basis of this industrial growth. In this graph, in the image, we wanted to show this relation between sugar and work. We took the sugar cones, so the objects that were also mentioned several times today, which are ceramic objects that were used for processing sugar, and we used them as visual elements to make this relation more tangible. So the objects under the glass lid, the real objects here in the image, they're replicas of ceramic vases or ceramic how do you call cones that were used in the refinery. The pot and the cone were used in a way that the cone was placed upside down in the pot, and when it would be heated, raw sugar that was placed in the cone was purified in a way that the byproducts would seep down through the hole in the middle and in the bottom, and different degrees of refined sugar were left in the cone, with molasses at the bottom and white grains of sugar at the top, and all shades in between. The white sugar at the top was the most refined and valuable at the time, and all of the racist kind of analogies that you can make about this different values between different types of sugar are true. We used this visualization in contrast to the others. So the visualization that I was talking about is the one on the left, The other on the right now shows the cone sitting on its base, and it resembles a class pyramid in which we inserted data taken from an account that looked into the worker stratification within the company at the time of its highest productivity. This stratification in rough terms cut across all the 50 years of existence of the company, so kind of what percentage of people are in which type of labor, and then in which amount of remuneration comparatively. So in the top echelon, we have the management, initially the combination of the Austro-Habsburg nobility and the Antwerp bourgeoisie. Then the skilled workers in the middle, they were coming from other European cities with developed sugar industry. Maybe some later became educated in the Rijeka refinery and were traveling like locals, but in general, during the time when the refinery was working, the unskilled labor was from the regions around Rijeka. Still, what is missing in this image is the slave labor that was the basis for the major part of the sugar production, which was performed in the overseas colonies of the European colonial powers that the Austro-Hungary was not a part of. Today, when Dale spoke about the production in Cuba, he was talking about production with the final product also being produced in Cuba. In the case of the Rijeka refinery, semi-refined sugar was brought to the company, and then the final steps were done in Rijeka. But the percentage of these final steps is the minority of production. So just looking at this kind of resentment of this ethnic question that arose in critiques in the local writing really completely ignores the fact that the most exploited labor was overseas. Or to say it in a different way, vedute date are not showing black African slaves whose labor was the basis for the global sugar trade and the prosperity of Rijeka's sugar industry. Still, the slaves in the image seem to be the only indicator of their existence within the narrative of Rijeka's industrialization. Okay. We will do a small detour now to a well-known project we have actually come across some time ago, first in another type of research dealing more with issues about data visualization, but it was mentioned again in the talk in Rotor when we had, and it makes very tangible a thing we want to say. So firstly, this is not our project, just to emphasize. We're showing it only to help place Rijeka on the map of global trade and global extractivism. In the top left corner, what you see is the time, the years passing by. The projects show slave ships and their human cargo on the way from Africa to mostly Americas and sometimes Europe. No ship in this visualization will travel to Rijeka. Still, sugar production was one of the main branches of agrarian industry in which slave labor was used. This is the opening of the Rijeka refinery. So even if ships represented in this visualization are not coming to Rijeka, Rijeka is part of this map. The visualization will roll in the background, and we will only emphasize now still when around the time when the company was closing. It runs for about 50 years. From reading on the company's history, I didn't understand really what the end date is. It can be found, but this is the time when it's already closed. This is also the time of the expansion, so that time was the time of expansion of the slave trade, but as Dale said, the early 1800s, so until the mid-century, were the biggest expansion, not necessarily to Great Britain, but to Portuguese colonies and other. So, During the 19th century, as you saw, slave labor was outlawed in most of the colonial empires, and the map or the travel stops. Yes. The building in this image, which is also shown in the museum now, it was built as a headquarters of the privileged company of Trieste and Rijeka. Sorry. After its demise as sugar production headquarters in the beginning of the 19th century, it was first a military headquarters for a while, then a tobacco producing plant, a company making ship motors, and since end of 2020, it houses the City of Rijeka Museum collection. In the new museum setup, for the first time, this global connection of Rijeka is on permanent display, together with the aforementioned painting at its center. Still in the contemporary decolonial move that many institutions are undertaking globally, we believe that this is the moment to make this connection between slavery and industrialization in Rijeka more direct. Today we went again after I think more than a year that we visited the setup recently, like last, and in some sense there is this narrative that when you walk from the room where the paintings are, you enter into the room in which there is kind of images of slavery and the work that was done in the colonies. Then you come to the next room where you have the what is called the kitchen or the factory in which the production was done with representation of white laborers, and then you have the sugar cones in the end. So somehow this narrative can be traced with how it is exhibited. At the same time, we think that the discussion on this issue should be somehow more emphasized. The fact that colonialism fueled the economic development of colonial powers has been generally acknowledged, but the local political and economic elites from the European periphery, even though many times politically subordinated, also profited from colonialism by means of trade and the circulation of goods, with consumer products permeating everyday lives of the regional, lower and working classes also. Maybe they were behind the locks, as Anton was saying before, but there was more and more sugar present in the European market from the 18th century until it became a proletarian commodity, also helping workers to sustain their the working hours that they needed to work in coal mines, etc. Rijeka sugar industry diminished due to many interrelated factors, the end of monopoly on sugar processing and trade within the empire, and the introduction of sugar beet being probably the most relevant reasons, even though, as we heard today, sugar beet wasn't really introduced in the time when the company was open, so we need to revisit this as an argument. Still, abolitionism was certainly not the reason for the end of sugar production in Rijeka. Still, the first major industrialization of the city happened on the basis of this exquisite colonial merchandise production. So, that's it. We're finished. Sorry, it's a bit...
Okay, thank you. So maybe now we can start with you, as you are already here. If there are any questions or comments also. It can be also from our online participants. If somebody has, I don't
there.
Dale. Okay, maybe we can.
Mute there. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Okay. I saw this the last time, and I saw it again, and it fascinates me. The company is from the Antwerp or the Belgium, right? It's
so the management, the management of the company comes from Antwerp, yes. But the
Antwerp, yeah.
Initiative
so
from,
yeah. I can't give up the idea that I mean, the images of the workers may be total fantasy, but I can't give up the idea that perhaps it's a reference to the Dutch East Indies, because the Dutch were actually not very successful in the Caribbean in the 19th century. But the West Indies East Indies was their major source of colonial product, sugar and coffee. So I don't know. I mean, it's just a suggestion, but it seems to me to be worth pursuing.
What you are saying, Dale, is, if I understand you correctly, is that the images are actually showing the slave labor that was producing sugar, or the wish of the Dutch colonists at the time, because they were successful in the East Indies.
In the East Indies, where Asian and even Chinese workers would have been a possibility, because by the 19th century, the Dutch really weren't producing sugar very much at all in the Caribbean, and their whole colonial base was in the East Indies. It's the anomaly of the Netherlands and the Low Countries. It's just a suggestion. I don't know, but it seems to fit the image better. I mean,
Thanks. I mean, we will. You commented the last time as well, and in a sense, it is a thing that we need to develop further. In some sense, having the Antwerp family starting the sugar business as kind of the people that were carrying the knowledge, we think that it has to do, like the reason while the Habsburgs invited them, we think it has to do just with the fact that the know-how in Europe, as we read, was from the 13th century on, in actually based in Antwerp. But what you are saying, we never basically managed to look into that direction, and we will.
Okay, well, I will email you. I have a friend in Amsterdam who's writing a book on the history of the Dutch and the East India trade. He's very good, so maybe he knows the companies and all of. So maybe he can give you some help. I don't know. I'll send that to you via email after we're done.
Thank you, Dale. Okay, we will proceed now with Catherine. Catherine, do you hear us? Like Eurovision, do you hear us? Catherine?
Yes, I hear you. Yes,
okay,
this is
great.
Yorkshire calling. Good evening. I thank you so much for both those presentations, which followed mine, all of you, and I think I have a reflection which maybe connects some points which all of you were making. Anton asked, what did Habsburg consumers, Austrian consumers, or indeed consumers in Rijeka know about sugar? Did they know it had anything to do with slavery? And this is something which historians might try to answer through looking at advertising from the time, product design from the time. In the classic pattern of commodity racism is products would be advertised with, pictures and stereotypes depicting the place of origin. So, I'm wondering what might there be in, the museum of the city of Rijeka, or, in other sources that you've got, which actually show how sugar was being marketed then. And if we follow that question further then, did people know that it came from the Caribbean? How much did people know about slavery there? Again, if we could try and reconstruct the sort of circulation of knowledge about the Caribbean and about slavery at that time, we might ask questions like, okay, well, were campaigns for the abolition of slavery, like, those being led by William Wilberforce and others in Britain, for instance, being reported? Was the Haitian Revolution, or other slave revolts, including those in Jamaica and other sugar-producing islands, being reported? This is perhaps how we can start to reconstruct that context of knowledge and begin to answer these questions. So I don't know if that prompts any further reflections from anyone.
Okay.
It's a comment I had for Catharine's talk earlier, but it also connects to our work. And so my initial, I'm going to try to make sense, but basically it starts from what Catharine, you were saying about owning images of slaves as a status. And so that also brings me a little bit back to a conference we were recently on, which titled Whiteness as Property, which links kind of owning property as something that defines whiteness. And so these two kind of, let's say, these two anchor points I want to use to kind of think about this official understanding of kind of the link of Austria-Hungary developing the company within Rijeka favorably. So this thing that we refer to as the petit bourgeois admiration for the industrialists and the development of Rijeka. Could we read this in this now thing that we're establishing now as kind of a racial kind of a reading of race in this region as kind of a wish for whiteness of the local bourgeoisie, kind of attaining whiteness through kind of through this kind of following of the company and its kind of accumulation as kind of or kind of favorably within the local context as kind of looking at the self-image of kind of Rijeka bourgeoisie, kind of approaching whiteness through kind of how the industrialization develops in Rijeka and how this kind of makes it closer to European centers and so on. So I hope this makes sense. It's kind of something that I'm building, trying to put together several pieces, but somehow a proposal or kind of a question.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so do we have any comments, questions from the audience here? Okay.
I would have one question to Eva and Elvis, because today was the first time that we saw the City Museum and the rooms created. I have one question to you. Have the experts, let's say, from the city museums, the historians, so on, contacted you because you did the research from really some years before they opened all that, how to say, to make it publicly accessible, let's say, the building. I think it was in the year 2000, in the frame of the year 2020. I don't know exactly when it was opened, but it's at least 2 or 3 years later after your researches, that I would be really interested if there was, how to say, a communication with you as local experts, because it could highly influence their presentation of the rooms, you know?
No, but it has to do with our also partial reach out in some sense, because we did research, but we didn't really come to the point that we felt that or our research process wasn't really that much, we used more like desk research than interview methods and similar, and in some sense I would also like for us to do that in the future. So in some sense it's also the question of knowledge. I mean, maybe some of them knew of what we were doing because we spoke with them, but we weren't really in a close dialogue, because our, let's say, this research wasn't that much, we didn't do that type of outreach.
Yeah, perhaps it was not that visible in Rijeka itself, although it did first.
Which we do think it's a pity, but we wouldn't kind of like to put the guilt on the other side. In this sense, it's kind of a it's a two-sided thing.
Okay, but now we have this possibility to have your work here in Rijeka. Okay.
Yeah, it's better with that. Yeah, thank you. I want to stress out a little bit this question of how much information the product itself transports, or how the customers and consumers know about what a product brings along. And if I think about today consumerist society in an information world, it makes me doubt that there was also in the past too much known. Because if you remember, for example, I will give only one example about, that was maybe 10, 15 years ago when there was a lot of information coming along about the conditions of strawberry production in Spain. So that was a lot about modern slavery, about exploitation of mainly illegalized migrants from Africa coming to Spain and working on these huge strawberry fields. But did that change anything in the consumerist behavior of the Central Europeans? I don't think so. Yeah, there were various reports in the media, in the newspapers, but they didn't change too much. Yeah? And today, when we think about the conditions of sugar production today, and when we know or start to know that there is a relation in Brazil, for instance, between the cut of the rainforest and the expansion of the sugar industry, sugar fields and sugar production in Brazil, and the relation between the politics of Bolsonaro and these developments, and Brazil became world #1 sugar producer 2 years ago. So nobody actually knows that, even today, you know. So just through the work of Ferenc Grof, I think now a small minority of Graz inhabitants that visited the exhibition and found that information in this overwhelming source of information became aware of this. Yeah? So it's even today, sugar is coming along as something unguilty.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, what Anton just said, it's really interesting point of view, and I think that it's really opening a question for us. I mean, for me at least, because I'm always thinking about what is the right approach. I mean, where to place responsibility. Who is responsible for this type of action? You know, that we as consumers are consuming the sugar from Brazil or straws from Spain. So this is a quite, I think, complex question. Is it the responsibility on the kind of individual? I mean, on a person who is taking this straw and doesn't think about it? Or on a system? But then, I mean, we are creating that system. So how to place this responsibility? What I see is somehow that we are all delegating responsibility to somebody else. You know, for example, I mean, I will give another example. It's a world champion in football that will be happening in Qatar. You know, and there is for decade it's reports about kind of conditions of work of the people, kind of taking the passports of the workers, working without the payment. It's not called slavery, but you know, it's kind of that type of definition is also kind of something that is really important. How we define slavery? How we define? I mean, if somebody is working for a year without the papers, without the salary, how can we call that? You know, and these are the things that are interesting. And what I want to say, and most of the people at least in Western Europe and also here in kind of Croatia, would say, yeah, but FIFA should decide that, you know, but, you know, it's kind of delegation of the responsibility. And that reminds me on a book of Richard Sennett, The New Culture of Capitalism, who said that kind of one of the main kind of characteristics of today's capitalism, but he was talking more about organizational context, is that there is an authority without responsibility. Everybody wants authority, but nobody wants to take responsibility. So for me, this is a really important question, as you said in your talk, consciousness, and what to do with that consciousness, you know, where to place the responsibility for these type of actions. So these are the things that I mean, I don't have an answer. I'm also kind of posing the question as you did. But I mean, I think that this is a kind of critical question that we kind of need to deal somehow with. Just a comment. Yeah, it's not a question.
Okay, we have time for one more comment or two. Okay.
Yeah, actually, I would love to see Messi and Mbappe going on strike in defense of all these workers. Actually, that's for sure. And thanks for your comment. It's very interesting. And just another thing, just a little comment about how we can imagine the work together later on. That what Catherine told in her presentation, this to think together with the post-socialist condition and the post-colonial questions, and how we can dig deeper in this, you know. Yeah, I think, so I find it very inspiring, these questions. So thank you very much.
We are naturally coming to the end. Okay, so we are finishing today. So in the end of this day, we have to say that this sweet sugar leaves bad taste. We will see what will happen tomorrow. So tomorrow we are again here at 12 o'clock. We postpone it from 11 to 12. Tomorrow will be with us Kolja Abramski, Graciela Carnevale, and Ilona Nemet. So please join us here or online. You are welcome. Thank you very much to all our participants online and offline or here in Filodrammatica. Thanks to all audience online and here with us in Filodrammatica. This is it. Have a nice evening.